everyone, Donne here, and today I am finally catching up on my reading wrap-ups. I had a whole year of reading, mostly on audiobook, which is a huge change for me, and stopped making my wrap-up videos. I missed it and I want to do catch up. We are starting possibly with the technically least interesting category, but go with it. I've broken up the 50 odd books I read in the last year to categories. This is the kind of general nonfiction catch up video. I'm also going to finally make that mountaineering nonfiction video. Like, that is a whole separate thing unto itself of like 16 books. Also going to do the celebrity memoir extravaganza. I read a lot, including some of the juiciest ones from 2022, and I do have saucy thoughts about more than one of them, and then of course catching up on my thriller TBR. I'm actually still in the middle of doing that catch up, but very excited. I'm gonna have like 12 or 13 books to talk about for that one. So this one's actually the most contained. I'm going to be talking about 8 books, and they kind of range from books I read like 8 months ago to more recently. And generally the disclaimer is, which is probably gonna save us all in the end, we know how long and rambly my book wrap-ups can be. My memory is gonna be fuzzier on some of these, so I should hopefully be a little bit more concise. And just a point of distinction, some of these technically kind of wobble over memoir space, like almost possibly celebrity memoir space, but I made the executive decision, the creative decision on 2 titles specifically, putting them in general nonfiction, because the celebrity memoir one is like really like celebrity memoirs, whereas we'll talk about how these books straddle the line, essentially. So let's get started with a double feature, a compare and contrast. 2 books on essentially the same topic. They came out at around the same time, but I had slightly different experiences reading. So I read She Said by Jodi and Megan Twohey, and I read Catch and Kill by Ronan Farrow. I'm gonna talk about She Said first, then Catch and Kill. That's the reverse order that I read them. And yes, this is because I watched She Said when it was added to Peacock and was like, I want to read the books about this. Though I say that it's actually kind of hard. I find it hard to talk about one without discussing the other, so there might be some crossover, but we'll theoretically technically start with She Said. The first thing is, if you've also seen the movie definitely took some creative liberties. I found it fascinating reading these 2 back to back, because She Said glosses over certain things and how much of things were from Ronan Farrow's reporting, not from the New York Times. It's definitely, in that sense, a glossy Hollywood movie that wants to tell a very specific kind of story. Not to undermine any of the reporting that Jodi and Megan did, but if you read Catch and Kill, you get a much better picture of the work Ronan Farrow was doing for several years before the New York Times came in and did their reporting. With She Said, my overall initial takeaway, like my overall thought, it's a lot drier than Catch and Kill. This is actually a theme with a couple of these other ones. Like, when you read nonfiction books by journalists who err more on the side of news reporting, financial reporting, those sorts of things, often their writing style is just a bit more dry. This leans dry. I definitely found myself more than once pushing myself through the reading experience, like forcing myself to go back to the audiobook because I'm a completionist, darn it, and especially because I'd already read Catch and Kill. It's like, I have to read the duology, essentially. But that does beg the question, was I a little less compelled to push through this because I had just finished Catch and Kill? Though I actually got She Said off library hold first, and I listened to a couple chapters and wasn't overly like invested. And then as soon as Catch and Kill was available, I breezed through that one really, really fast. Just generally, that is definitely a note. Overall though, it is obviously, because it's by New York Times reporters, fantastically sourced. It's in depth. It's a big chunk of info that you can digest on the whole Harvey Weinstein Me Too topic. But in part because of the readability thing and kind of what we'll call the 3rd act twist, not really. But Catch and Kill and She Said go in very different directions for their third acts and their overall framing, smartly to differentiate themselves from each other. And this one, I recommend it to passionate nonfiction fans where you are a seasoned nonfiction reader and so you can push through slightly drier writing because you're interested in the topic, and thus only if you are interested in the topic, rather than recommending this more broadly to anyone and everyone who might be interested. About that third act twist and scope. It's just the scope. So the scope of this one really does get into the believing women side of things, which obviously I passionately believe in, but because the reporters, the next big story they worked on essentially was Christine Blasey Ford and Brett Kavanaugh, that is the back half of this book. So they're kind of morphing or merging the Harvey Weinstein coverage with the Christine Blasey Ford coverage to draw like bigger conclusions and thematically talk about the Me Too, the evolution of Me Too and its repercussions and meanings and how it can kind of, the sharp-edged sword of it. And that is interesting, but it just, the book really fell in the middle for me overall. I'm not mad I read it, but I'm not falling over myself to recommend it to you, and ultimately I'm not sure how much of it long-term is going to stick in my craw, so to speak. Which brings us to Catch and Kill. If you can't tell, overwhelmingly, I vastly preferred Catch and Kill by Ronan Farrow for a variety of reasons. First, the writing style was a lot more like, it was mainstream, commercial. It was written for that audience. I loved the audiobook. Ronan Farrow read it and he has a fantastic narration voice. And also scope and theme. While in She Said, Jodi and Megan are characters in a sense, they're not really. And ultimately, don't we love this about nonfiction? But some of the most interesting investigative reporting nonfiction stems from when the journalist does get really entangled and starts to face personal consequences and how dramatic that can be. And in Ronan Farrow's specific case, because he actually originated this reporting and went through a ton of shit because of trying to get this story published, that the New York Times didn't go through in the same way because they came to this after Ronan Farrow's story had been basically squashed in NBC News. His story is just way more dramatic. It takes place over a longer period of time. You have the shenanigans of NBC News and corruption and the shadiness of, you know, they were quashing this story and then there's Matt Lauer and just the complication of all of those things that literally there's like a spy thriller aspect to it because of, I don't want to spoil all the fun twists and turns of Catch and Kill, but some crazy stuff happens because of Weinstein and firms that he hired to follow Ronan Farrow. It is tense and suspenseful at many turns because he legitimately became a figure in the story where it could have gone very, very differently. And so you're on the edge of your seat in a lot of ways, even though you know how things turned out. And then this is also down to personal preference. I found the angle of the broader implications for media and these big corporations and the responsibility of journalism, but how cronyism and corruptness actually leads to stories like this often being suppressed, and it's the reason they were suppressed for such a long time and probably still are in a lot of cases. There's probably so much we don't know. I find that media angle really, really compelling because it's frustrating and chilling and it pisses me off. I just wholeheartedly recommend Catch and Kill over She Said for a variety of reasons. But if you do want to read both, especially if you see the movie, Catch and Kill gives you a ton of the context that I think is missing from the movie, such as why certain women who were involved with the Harvey Weinstein scandal wouldn't talk to the New York Times, so they're not represented in the movie. She Said mentions them because of Ronan Farrow's reporting, and they're honest about that. Like, they're clear of what reporting and sourcing for the book came after their initial piece because people wouldn't speak to them before they published it because they didn't trust the New York Times because the New York Times had quashed sexual harassment reporting before in the past. a lot of these women trusted Ronan Farrow for very personal reasons, which Catch and Kill gets into, but you get a much clearer picture of who actually spoke to Ronan Farrow first, and then how the New York Times, while they broke the story technically, were really building in many ways off of his reporting. I find both sides of it really fascinating, like the who was willing to talk to Ronan versus who was willing to talk to the New York Times. There were clearly like preferences and lines. I did find that aspect very interesting reading both. So yeah, in a nutshell, I vastly preferred and enjoyed Catch and Kill. That's the one I wholeheartedly recommend if you want to read on this topic. If you want to read more on this topic, read both. It's a trilogy of Weinstein scandal books. There is a third one, and a friend of mine actually has the physical copy, and I've been meaning to borrow it. So maybe I'll complete the trilogy and read that one as well. But moving on to a different kind of scandal, much older, also inspired by a movie. I read Molly's Game. I've seen this movie multiple times. I have this little soft spot for Aaron Sorkin. I'm not a West Wing girly, surprisingly, but all of his features, I like them. I can watch The Social Network ad nauseum. I've watched Molly's Game multiple times. I like his directorial work. And I also really like Jessica Chastain, and I like stories about intense women, and I love celebrity scandal. Long story short, I was like, I should read Molly's Game. I've seen his movie multiple times. I'm really, really curious. The first thing to know is Molly's Game is definitely a bit dated. It was published in 2014, and it was published before all the legal stuff kind of sorted itself out. So the end of the movie, the end of the story, is sourced on what actually ended up happening to Molly and Aaron Sorkin interviewing her a bunch. In fact, there's a ton of details in the movie that come from Aaron Sorkin talking to Molly after the fact that aren't in the book. But the book is regardless a pretty entertaining, like, blow by blow of the general story. She names names on celebrities more than you get in the movie. She only names names of celebrities who were already implicated, so she's not blowing anyone who we don't already know about. But I will say that part of it is genuinely juicy. The movie embellished certain things about the game and her life, but didn't even scratch the surface of how sociopathic one particular celebrity was. And look, I know it's technically public and it's in the book, but I want to protect my ass and not even say their name in this video. But if you know, you know, and it is fascinating and eye-opening. It's also just interesting to compare because you can definitely see the creative massaging work of Aaron Sorkin and also the magic of casting. Jessica Chastain, well, between Jessica Chastain and Aaron Sorkin, they craft Molly into a very specific kind of cinematic character who doesn't necessarily wash with who Molly actually is. So meaning the actual Molly of Molly's Game, her memoir, is in many ways she's a lot more normal, and you read it and you go, oh, I actually have a much better handle on this person and who this person is, and the story in many ways makes more sense. Though both the movie and the book gloss over. I saw this in a couple reviews, and when someone mentioned it, I was like, oh, that makes a lot more sense. You kind of should read it with the back of your mind knowing she glosses over so much drug use. So much drug use. And so if you read it in her voice and understand her as a person and then go, and they were all using a lot of drugs, the whole thing makes a lot more sense. And just generally in the memoir, it goes a lot more into her love life, which is something that they kept out of the movie entirely. And so it's definitely more of a, you know, normal-ish girl has crazy experience and gets into serious legal trouble. And as I said, it ends before the end of the real story. But you know what? It was perfectly entertaining. I feel like I learned something about poker. Whether I'll retain it, who knows? But I definitely feel like it explains poker very, very well. And it's a wonderful supplement for the movie, which I like. And if you've never seen the movie, see the movie. It's incredibly entertaining. And yeah, it was just a good read for a juicy story that's celebrity adjacent. Yeah. Oh, speaking of a juicy story, I read The Palace Papers by Tina Brown, which, it's hard to talk about this one without talking about Spare. I read The Palace Papers months before Spare came out, in part in preparation for Spare, and my opinion of The Palace Papers shifted slightly after reading Spare, but we're saving the Spare review for the celebrity memoir video. So, okay. I already know that I like Tina Brown. I read the Diana Chronicles by Tina Brown and I thought it was an excellent book. She was there for all of this stuff. She has some intimate relationships with certain royals, like meaning like as a reporter. You know, she was in the box with the Queen and the princes for, I think, one of the concerts that they talk about. So like she has access, and she's been part of the British and US kind of tabloid press, but like more respected. She hasn't worked for the really trashy papers. She's been in this world for a really long time. She writes very colorfully. They're entertaining reading experiences without a doubt. Makes them digestible and easy to read. And she knows an F ton. And generally speaking, I found this in the Diana Chronicles and I found this for 90% of the Palace papers. She's pretty fair. Like you can tell that she is a royalist. She is definitely a royalist, but that doesn't mean that she's not going to be pretty honest about some of the shadier stuff. So it's definitely interesting. Essentially, the Palace Papers picks up where the Diana Chronicles left off, so I actually think they make a great kind of sequential reading, and it's all the stuff that the royals have been up to since, talking about William and Kate, Harry and Meghan, Charles and Camilla, all of the after stuff. So I read this book and I was ready to give it 5 stars, fully engaged, and then I finally got to the Harry and Meghan part. It's the most recent and she indeed saves it for later. And that's when I just started feeling really icky, because it started to feel biased in a really weird way that I didn't feel her previous stuff was. Because for example, she's very open and clear and it's well sourced about how Kate Middleton's mother groomed her daughter, primed her daughter to go to a specific school to bag a prince. And it is fascinating, but she also clearly likes them in a lot of ways. There's positive and also side eye all about the Middletons and Kate and William. But then we get to Harry and Meghan and it's pretty much 100, like she doesn't like Meghan. It's incredibly clear that she doesn't like Hollywood in a certain way and doesn't like the Hollywood Americanism in a certain way, and definitely is not a fan of Meghan Markle. And so it just gets really kind of mean toward the end, and also just badly sourced in my opinion. And I dropped my star rating down when I initially read it to 3 stars because just like the journalistic side of me was like, the sourcing got really bad in the section about Harry and Meghan. She only talked to people who affirmed what were clearly her feelings about Harry and Meghan and the whole situation, including just a lot of sourcing based on Meghan's dad, friends, like people that Meghan knew in high school who she's not friends with anymore. And I'm like, man, if you wrote a book on me based on people I was kind of friends with in high school who I'm not friends with anymore, you would also write a book where I came off as like a snobby, awful, fake person. I just thought it was like kind of weird. And just her implying that like everything about Meghan is fake, and I'm like, or maybe she majored in political science at Northwestern and genuinely enjoys charity work. Asterisk, that said, I'm not saying there aren't aspects of Meghan that are definitely questionable and fake, just that it didn't feel like Tina Brown made any effort whatsoever to have sourcing on both sides, and that was the question mark for me and left a bad taste in my mouth when I finished the Palace Papers. You'll get a preview. Having finished Spare, maybe I'll bump her up to a 4 because I'm like, okay, I see a lot more of this from literally Harry's own mouth about him and Meghan. I see a lot more of that perspective and I'm like, okay, maybe. Yet it still definitely rubs me the wrong way. Ultimately, what I think it is that the sources who would have provided for a more balanced reporting in that part of the book wouldn't speak to her. They wouldn't speak to her, and so ultimately everyone she spoke to did reaffirm how she clearly already thought and felt about the whole thing, and she is a royalist at the end of the day, and so the end of that book is biased in a lot of ways, and I just think time is going to tell whether it vindicates and justifies that bias. I'm already feeling a little more generous toward the book months later because I've read Spare, but those are my genuine feelings reading it. But if you are a royalist and you're watching this whole thing and you're just like, you know, eating crackers in bed, it is a good read and I do recommend it. Next, I read Normal Family by Chrysta Bilton. Just a fun one I discovered by looking for audiobooks available on Libby because I was jonesing to read something, and I'm really, really glad I read this. This is one of the better kind of non-famous people, public interest, pop culture-y nonfiction books I've read in a long time. I highly recommend it because it's just such a unique and fascinating story, and it sucked me right in. Essentially, if you've ever seen the Vince Vaughn movie Delivery Man and you want to know the real story behind that, but not heartwarming at all, that's this book, Normal Family. Delivery Man was very clearly based on Chrysta's story, essentially, but told from the point of view of the sperm donor dad in this case, and the real sperm donor dad is... The backstory is there was a guy in Southern California in LA who did a ton of sperm donations to a specific clinic, and he became the most popular donor in this clinic's history, meaning they gave his sperm to hundreds and hundreds of people. And this story is part of the reason there are much better regulations now about this thing, because essentially it came out years later that there were dozens upon dozens upon dozens of these kids who were now finding each other through like genetic, like ancestry.com type websites, and realizing who the donor dad was, that they all had the same donor dad, and, you know, kind of forming communities with each other. And Chrysta was in the unique position. He was her donor dad, but not from the sperm clinic. And you get the entire backstory of Donor 150 and with her mom. Basically, her mom was like this socialite type in LA in the 70s and 80s, like had threesomes with Warren Beatty, so you get some like juicy stuff about her mom's wild life. But her mom was a lesbian and wanted a child, and the 80s was it was almost impossible for her as a lesbian woman, but also as a single woman, to have a baby. So she found a hot guy at a hair salon and said, "Will you be the father of my children?" And she took him to the clinic to get his sperm so that she could inseminate herself. And he realized, doing this for her, for this woman, I can get paid to do this. He was kind of a vagrant type. He was a waiter at the time. You know, he wanted to be a musician, had like long, beautiful blonde hair, living the life. And he was like, I can get paid. And in the early years of Chrysta's life, she also has a sister. So her mother did this twice with him, and the whole time had no clue that he was donating sperm to the clinic on the side. In fact, she had made an agreement with him that he would never do this for anyone else, just for her, so that her children would like, it would just be her children. And, you know, for a couple years, she let him live with them, but eventually, you know, he had a lot of problems and he became homeless. And what makes the whole thing interesting is Donor 150 was a homeless drug addict who lived on Venice Beach and was her like messed up weird dad that she kind of had a relationship with as a kid. And so Normal Family walks you through her childhood and her life experiences and some pretty wild stuff with her mom and her dad, and then finding out that she had, as of the publication of this book, at least 35 half-siblings because he donated so much, and there's probably way more out there. And it's just, yeah, it's about her life and her feelings about this whole thing, and I just found it so compelling. The way that she told the story, I found it fascinating. It reads edge of your seat in a lot of cases because you're like, what is the next crazy life phase with her mom? Like, there's other stuff that I don't want to spoil, like what's gonna happen with her dad. You know, I really liked it. Highly recommend. If you also like these kind of juicy rip from the headline stuff, but like you want to know the true human angle, because it's complicated. It is not heartwarming, and it's not just a movie where it's like, oh, he has all these kids, isn't that sweet? Real life isn't always so sweet, so highly recommend. Next is one of my favorite reads of 2022 that is honestly probably gonna go on my all-timer list. Like, this is one of the ones that is technically a celebrity memoir. Molly's Game was kind of the other one I was thinking of, but I put it on this list because it's really it's not a celebrity memoir the way that other celebrity memoirs are celebrity memoirs. And this book was beautiful and meaningful and moving, and it stuck with me, and I'm definitely gonna reread it, and I want her to write more. Run Towards the Danger by Sarah Polley. Incredible. I can't say enough about this book. And that's the thing. I'm classing it a nonfiction because it is a series of essays that Sarah wrote about different topics, and they jump around. This isn't a standard play-by-play of her life. And in fact, there are massive things she leaves out, which, you know, on the one hand, I'm like, oh, that's kind of a disappointment. On the other hand, I'm like, write another book, Sarah. You're incredible. I mean, she just won an Oscar for Best Adapted Screenplay. She's an incredible writer and artist. But also I was able to then watch her documentary, which filled in some blanks. So if you don't know, Sarah Polley was a child actor in Canada. I grew up watching Sarah Polley because she was Ramona in the Ramona movies, and she was in Road to Avonlea, which I definitely watched. But then when she became a teen, she kind of disappeared from the spotlight as an actress, and I knew that she'd become a writer and director, but like reading this also filled in a lot of blanks about kind of the adult that she grew into, and just her thoughts on being a child actor and the whole industry. Fascinating. And so the essays, they jump around. There is one all just about her experience filming The Adventures of Baron Munchausen. And of course, my memory of that is I hated that movie as a kid, which is kind of, well, she hated making it, so that kind of works out. But she talks about being a child actor on a set and being in unsafe conditions and feeling like she wasn't being protected. And so there are reflections there about her own parents and like getting her into the industry. The entire opening essay is, I don't want to spoil any of the good parts of this book, but it's this, she did a play when she was a teen, and she had like massive scoliosis, and so it's about like a surgery that she had, and also being in this play and a specific kind of anxiety that she had doing this play as a teenager and reflecting on her mother's death from cancer when she was 11, and she did this play pretty soon after, and how it was all kind of wrapped up in this really complex, weird relationship with her dad. Again, I don't want to spoil it, but that essay is powerful essay. That, I mean, some of them are very long, like they're like these long stories, but that one, I mean, but all of them. She has a very long piece about sexual assault. She was sexually assaulted by someone who, I mean, later there was literally a trial about him sexually assaulting women, Jean Gomeshi. You might be familiar with the name, but she talks about that entire thing and why she chose not to speak up at the time, and kind of the weight of that choice and the repercussions and the complexity of being a victim. And you know, I don't want to, it's heavy stuff. It's really heavy stuff. It's not a normal memoir. It's really not. Just the whole title of it, Run Towards the Danger. She suffered a major concussion, and so in the latter part of the book, she talks about recovering from a serious brain injury. Oh gosh, the whole chapter about high-risk pregnancy and being pregnant while still grieving the mother who died when you were young. Like, that had me crying on a bus. Just like, and of course I was like crying on a bus and sniffling. I'm like, I hope they don't think I have COVID. This is last year, but I was like, because the book, I had to turn off the audiobook at a certain point because I was genuinely emotional. Like, Sarah Polley is a beautiful writer. I was moved by these stories. I found them thought-provoking and moving and emotional, and I loved it. 5 stars. It is heavy. So like, you know, I some of the trigger warnings, you know, it talks about sexual assault. It talks about death from cancer at a young age. It talks about high-risk pregnancy, and like pregnant, you know, miscarriages and that kind of stuff. It doesn't explicitly talk about CSA, but it talks about inappropriate relationships with young children, because the play she was in was Alice in Wonderland. She talks about Lewis Carroll. So like, you know, content warning for all those sorts of stuff. It's a heavy book, but it was beautiful and I loved it. Highly recommend, and Sarah Polley, please write more books like this. Please write more books. And I really need to see women talking. I need to watch that, so yeah. Next, I read Outsmarting the Sociopath Next Door, you know, just being on Libby and being like, I want to listen to an audiobook, and it was available and I listened to it. This is obviously a topic that I find really, really interesting. Now, I still haven't read Martha Stout's first book on this topic. This is essentially the sequel, which was simply called The Sociopath Next Door. And that was more like, from looking it up, it doesn't have an audiobook on Libby, so I haven't listened to it yet. That's why. That was more like, you know, spotting and identifying sociopaths in society, like the normal sociopath. And this one was more about like, I mean, it's in the title, Outsmarting, like coping mechanisms and tips and tricks for how to respond and how not to respond to someone who may or may not have an empathy deficit, which is the nice way that I'm gonna put it. It was definitely entertaining. She has some really interesting like case studies and stories that are inspired by real things but fictionalized to protect people. Quick, easy read. If this is a pop culture topic that interests you, it's a pop culture topic that interests me. I enjoyed the read. It was good. I said there were 8 books, but I'm gonna slide in an 8.5. I reread like 70% of Confessions of a Sociopath on audiobook before my hold expired. I've already read this book. I read it years ago and I got it on Libby after finishing this one, so it's just worth a mention. I've read it in the past. It's an interesting book, again, if you're interested in this pop culture topic. One of the most interesting things to me is, so it was written by someone who is a sociopath, and it's them telling their life story and their perspective. And what I found interesting, while they know they are a sociopath and they admit to it and they talk very frankly about a lot of things, you still like, there's like a secondary level of reading it as a non-sociopathic person, because she's saying like she's self-aware but isn't self-aware, and that's what makes the read really, really interesting. Like the places where her ego comes through and the places where you really have to question the veracity of what she's saying or the reality of what she's saying. It's an interesting read in that sense, but it definitely has that fatal flaw of like, I mean, you're in the head of a very grandiose individual who has their own like warped perception of themselves in the world, but very interesting. So I should probably go back and finish that reread, but I have read it before, so it technically counts as a book. So that's another one that I read. Had a pretty good, I thought the audiobook narrator did a good job of being very like, the tone with which they read it I thought was quite good as well. And last but not least, but kind of least, like this one was very similar to She Said for me. I read The Cult of We because yes, I watched We crash on Apple TV. Like 90% of my nonfiction reads are based off of watching something and then being like, I want to read a book about this. So yeah, I watched We Crashed and I looked for an audiobook, and this one was available. It was written by 2 Wall Street Journal reporters who did a ton of the original reporting of breaking the story of all the wild stuff going on at WeWork, the malfeasance, etc. But much like She Said, it's a little dry. I mean, these are ultimately finance reporters. Most of the purview of the story was finance. And so it can be dry at times, but regardless was a pretty, like, it carried me along. The writing was still like definitely propulsive in certain places, but drier in other places. But if you want like a good snapshot of more or less start to finish of the whole thing, if you've watched documentaries, if you've watched We Crashed, I do think it's good supplementary reading. It's just definitely on the drier end, so much like She Said, I would recommend this one to more seasoned nonfiction readers or people with specific, like serious topical interests. Like you really want to read a book on WeWork and you're committed to reading a book on WeWork, then this one can work. But I don't recommend it so much for like the general, like if you are interested in pop culture and you want like a fun, salacious book on WeWork, I don't think this is the book. So it was just okay. I'm glad I read it. It was definitely, interesting, kind of the rabbit hole. And I did like, I will say, We Crashed is guilty of what a lot of TV shows are guilty of, where they're centering the bad guys, that does go in quotes, as as the main characters, and thus they take extra steps to humanize them. And obviously they are humans, but there's always going to, in trying to craft likable characters for a TV show, you're going to undercut some of the genuinely bad things that they did. And so what's lovely about nonfiction written by good journalists is that you get a lot more even keel. It's not trying that hard to make them likable characters because they're not trying to carry a TV show. And so it cuts through a lot of that noise, and definitely a good way to get the better version of the whole story. So that's it. We did it, the first of the catching up on my reading videos. Those are some nonfiction books I read in the last year. Kind of a mixed bag, but I mean, definitely some standouts like Catch and Kill, and Normal Family, and Run Towards the Danger. Those are the three that like highly recommend picking up. And yeah, we're in just a new era because I did every single one of these on audio. Thanks, Libby. So as always, guys, thank you so much for watching. As I said, I'm going to be doing other catch-up wrap-ups, some of them very, very juicy, so look for those. And as always, guys, happy reading.